While Hitler was consolidating his dictatorship in Germany, the world was demonstrating an extraordinary ability to ignore what was right in front of it. It was not naivety that allowed the rise of Nazism. It was fatigue, debt, fear, and in some cases ideological sympathy. Western democracies built their foreign policy on a single premise: that anything was preferable to another war. France had lost 1.4 million soldiers in the First World War. There was hardly a French family without a dead or a maimed member. The proportion of French casualties relative to its total population was devastating. In some northern villages, the men of an entire generation had disappeared. This collective wound did not heal in 20 years. When the French looked toward the future in the 1930s, they saw only another slaughter. The response was to build the Maginot Line. Initiated in 1930 under the direction of the Minister of War André Maginot, himself seriously wounded at Verdun, the line was a masterpiece of defensive engineering. It stretched from Switzerland to the Belgian border, kilometers of underground bunkers connected by railway tracks, with artillery cannons capable of covering the entire frontier with Germany, barracks for thousands of soldiers, hospitals, kitchens and ventilation systems designed to withstand an indefinite siege. It cost 5 billion francs and employed more than 30,000 workers for years. It was impenetrable, and it was useless, because the Maginot Line ended at the Belgian border and did not turn north to cover Belgian territory. The planners assumed that the Belgians would complete the line with their own fortifications, and that in any case the dense Ardennes forest to the north was an impassable natural obstacle for tanks. Both assumptions were wrong, and that mistake would cost France the war in 6 weeks. Great Britain had its own version of strategic paralysis. The governments of Ramsay MacDonald, Stanley Baldwin, and finally Neville Chamberlain made foreign policy decisions under the pressure of a public opinion terrified by the idea of another war. When the peace ballot of 1935 asked British citizens to take a position on military sanctions against international aggressors, more than 11 million responded. But the majority preferred economic sanctions over military ones, and a significant percentage rejected even economic measures. The message was clear: no government that wanted to be re-elected could talk about war. The result was the policy of appeasement. It was not, as it is sometimes described, mere cowardice. It was the logical consequence of democratic leaders responding to what their citizens demanded. Chamberlain genuinely believed that Hitler was a rational politician with whom one could negotiate, that his demands had limits, and that giving him what he wanted would avoid conflict. He was wrong about everything, but he acted in good faith. Meanwhile, Japan demonstrated that the League of Nations was a toothless institution. In September 1931, Japanese forces stationed in Manchuria, without even informing their own government in Tokyo, seized the capital Mukden and within a few weeks controlled the entire territory. The League condemned the aggression. Japan responded by leaving the organization in 1933. The world learned its first lesson. The consequences of violating the international order were almost non-existent. Benito Mussolini learned the lesson just as carefully. The Italian dictator, who had come to power in 1922 after the March on Rome, dreamed of rebuilding the Roman Empire. In December 1934, his forces provoked an incident at the oasis of Ual-Wal within the territory of Abyssinia, modern-day Ethiopia, and used it as a pretext for a full-scale invasion. Emperor Haile Selassie personally appealed before the League of Nations in Geneva. His speech was eloquent and moving. The League imposed economic sanctions on Italy, but deliberately excluded oil, because that could have truly crippled the Italian war machine, and neither Great Britain nor France had the stomach for military intervention. By May 1936, Abyssinia had fallen. The Italian army, with total air superiority and no hesitation in the use of gas bombs, prohibited since Versailles as a crime against humanity, had crushed armed forces that used spears and 19th-century rifles. The defeat of the last independent African kingdom was a humiliation for the system of collective security. The League had failed its most important test. Hitler observed all of this with clinical attention. Every action without consequences was a confirmation of his thesis. Western democracies were too weak, too divided, and too terrified by the memory of the Great War to resist pressure. The remilitarization of the Rhineland in March 1936, explicitly forbidden by Versailles, was the perfect example. Hitler sent 3 battalions of troops into the demilitarized territory. His own generals warned him that if France reacted militarily, they would have to withdraw immediately. Years later, Hitler himself admitted that the 48 hours following that decision were the most tense of his life. France and Great Britain protested diplomatically and did nothing more. The secret rearmament, the war machine. No one wanted to see. While Europe was looking towards Spain, Hitler was building the most modern army in the world. He did so partly in plain sight and partly in the shadows, and he did it by taking advantage of something no international treaty could forbid: military innovation in thought. In the years following Versailles, Weimar Germany had secretly signed the Treaty of Rapallo with the Soviet Union in 1922, which allowed it to develop and test tanks, aircraft and chemical weapons on Russian soil, equipment that the peace treaty prohibited in Germany. At facilities in Lipetsk in southern Russia, the future Luftwaffe trained its pilots. In Kazan, German officers experimented with new armored warfare tactics. But the real secret of the German army was not equipment, it was doctrine. Heinz Guderian, then a young communications officer, devotedly read the works of British military theorists Basil Liddell Hart and Colonel John Fuller. They had developed in the 1920s a theory of armored warfare based on speed, deep penetration, and the disruption of enemy communications rather than frontal collision. The British had even carried out practical exercises on Salisbury Plain during the 1920s, which Guderian studied closely. The historical paradox is remarkable. The conceptual inventors of Blitzkrieg were officers of the army that would later suffer its devastating effects. When Hitler publicly announced the existence of the Luftwaffe in March 1935, openly violating the Treaty of Versailles, he already had 2,500 aircraft, more than Britain and France combined. That same year, he reintroduced conscription into the German army, tripling its size to 300,000 men. The Franco-British reaction was a diplomatic protest, nothing more. The recruitment and training system of the new Wehrmacht was a model of efficiency. But what fundamentally distinguished it from its future adversaries was its tactical philosophy. German mid-level commanders, captains, lieutenant colonels, were authorized to make battlefield decisions without consulting upward. The principle of Auftragstaktik, the mission-based tactic, meant that a commander was given an objective but not prescribed how to achieve it. Individual initiative was a virtue, not insubordination. In the French and British armies, the chain of command was rigid and centralized. Nothing of importance was decided without higher authorization. When war began, that difference would prove decisive. By 1938, the German rearmament plan had created an unprecedented war machine. But Hitler could no longer wait for it to be fully complete. His personal physician, Dr. Theodor Morell, had warned him that his health was poor and that he needed to act quickly. Time, Hitler believed, was working against him. He needed to act before the democracies finished their own rearmament. In February 1938, Austrian Chancellor Kurt von Schuschnigg was summoned to the Berghof, Hitler's mountain retreat in Berchtesgaden. For hours, Hitler subjected him to brutal intimidation, threats of immediate invasion if Austria did not accept Austrian Nazis in government and tighten ties with the Reich. Schuschnigg yielded during the meeting, but back in Vienna he called a national referendum to ask Austrians whether they wanted to maintain independence. Hitler could not risk an adverse result. On March 12, 1938, the day before the referendum, German troops crossed the Austrian border. They met no resistance. Many Austrians welcomed them with flowers. Within hours, Hitler announced the Anschluss, the annexation of Austria into the Third Reich. A sovereign nation had been absorbed. Great Britain and France protested in diplomatic offices and did nothing more. The next target was Czechoslovakia, specifically the Sudetenland, where more than 3 million ethnic Germans lived. Hitler politically armed the local German minority through Konrad Henlein's Sudeten German Party, which began demanding autonomy and eventually incorporation into the Reich. When the Czechoslovak government mobilized its army in May 1938, Hitler backed down temporarily. The Czechoslovak army was substantial, well-armed, and its border fortifications were formidable. But British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain decided to intervene as a mediator. He flew to meet Hitler 3 times during September 1938. On September 29th in Munich, Chamberlain, French Prime Minister Édouard Daladier, Hitler and Mussolini signed an agreement handing the Sudetenland to Germany. Czechoslovakia was not invited to the conference, deciding the dismemberment of its territory. Its representatives waited in an antechamber. Upon hearing the terms, the Czechoslovak government wept. Chamberlain flew back to London, waving the agreement from the airplane steps. Peace for our time. The London crowd cheered him. Winston Churchill, then a backbench parliamentarian, described it differently. You were given the choice between dishonor and war. You chose dishonor. You will have war. In October 1938, German troops occupied the Sudetenland, and with it, the formidable Czech border defenses. The key protecting Czechoslovakia was now in German hands. The beginning of the end of peace, from Prague to Warsaw. Hitler had promised in Munich that the Sudetenland was his last territorial demand in Europe. It was a lie that he did not even bother to maintain for 6 months. In March 1939, he summoned the Czechoslovak president Emil Hácha to Berlin. Hácha was an elderly man with heart problems. He was subjected to hours of intimidation in which Hitler and Field Marshal Göring threatened to bomb Prague if he did not agree to place his country under the protection of the Reich. Hácha fainted. He was revived with an injection from Dr. Morel, and he signed. On March 15, 1939, German troops marched into Prague on a snowy morning. For the first time, Hitler had annexed territory with a non-German population. He was no longer the leader of a German nationalist cause. He was a conqueror. Great Britain and France protested. The German ambassador in London was summoned to the Foreign Office, and in the capitals of half of Europe, governments began making terrifying calculations about how much time they had left. Poland was next. Hitler demanded the return of the free city of Danzig, mostly German but under League of Nations administration, and the right of passage through the Polish corridor, the strip of territory that separated the rest of Germany from East Prussia. The Poles rejected both demands. Marshal Edward Śmigły-Rydz had received formal promises of military support from both Great Britain and France if Germany attacked. The two democracies, finally aware that appeasement had failed, declared at the end of March 1939 that they would guarantee Polish independence. Hitler heard the guarantees and did not take them seriously. He had a stronger argument than any diplomatic promise, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. On August 23, 1939, the world woke up to the news that Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, theoretically mortal enemies, the two systems that had confronted each other for the soul of Europe in Spain, had signed a non-aggression pact. The secret protocol of the agreement was even more explosive. Poland would be divided between the two countries, and Stalin would be given free rein to occupy Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Stalin's reasoning was a desperate gamble. Convinced that Great Britain and France had no real intention of resisting Hitler, he preferred to gain time and territory before the conflict reached Soviet borders. Hitler's reasoning was more direct. Without the danger of a two-front war, he could crush Poland without risk of Soviet intervention from the east. In the early morning of September 1, 1939, before dawn, German soldiers disguised as Poles attacked a German radio station in Gliwice near the border and left behind the bodies of concentration camp prisoners dressed in Polish uniforms. It was a grotesque staged pretext for war. At 8 a.m., the first German tanks crossed the border. 2 days later, on September 3rd, Great Britain and France declared war on Germany. They had fulfilled their promise, but it was already too late for Poland. Blitzkrieg, the lightning war that redefined combat. Poland in September 1939 was a perfect geographical trap. After the German takeover of Czechoslovakia, the country was surrounded by hostile territory on 3 of its 4 borders. Germany to the west and north, East Prussia to the northeast, and the recently annexed Czechoslovak territories to the south. When the Soviets crossed from the east, it would become a 4-jawed pincer. The Polish army had 500,000 men and possessed military courage. Its soldiers were hardened and its officers competent. But its tactical organization reflected a conception of war belonging to the past. 11 cavalry brigades, tanks dispersed among infantry divisions for support, and a defensive doctrine that assumed the front could remain static for weeks while reserves mobilized. Against this, Germany deployed 6 panzer divisions and 4 light divisions, 2,400 tanks in total, designed to operate as independent deep breakthrough units, not as infantry support. The concept of Blitzkrieg was deceptively simple. Concentrate armor and air power at a single point in the front, break through and then accelerate without stopping for resistance, leaving enemy strongpoints behind for infantry to reduce. The objective was not to destroy enemy positions one by one, but to cut communications, encircle units, and trigger the collapse of the enemy army's central nervous system before it could reorganize. Army Group North, under General Fedor von Bock, launched 2 thrusts from northeastern Germany and East Prussia. Army Group South, under General Gerd von Rundstedt, launched 2 more from Silesia and Slovakia. The 4 arms of the pincer converged on Warsaw and Brest-Litovsk. It was a classic encirclement maneuver, but executed at a speed that the previous model of warfare made impossible. The Polish Air Force was virtually destroyed in the first 2 days, not because its aircraft were on the ground, they had been preemptively dispersed to secondary airfields, but because German attacks neutralized the main supply and logistics airfields, making sustained operations impossible. Without air cover, Polish infantry and cavalry columns were exposed to the dive bombers of the Junkers Ju-87 Stuka, the aircraft that did most to create the legend of Blitzkrieg, with sirens mounted on their landing gear deliberately designed to produce a sound of psychological terror. On September 8th, less than a week after operations began, German panzer units had reached the outer suburbs of Warsaw. On September 17th, the day the outer pincers closed at Brest-Litovsk, Soviet troops crossed Poland's eastern border in accordance with the secret protocol of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. The pincer was complete. The Polish government fled abroad. Warsaw resisted. Its defenders rejected German ultimatums. Then the German war machine turned on the city with full force, sustained aerial bombardment, heavy artillery, infantry assaults from 3 sides. Hitler followed the advance from a special train nicknamed America, moving with his armies. On September 27th, Warsaw capitulated. The following day, Poland was divided according to the terms of the Nazi-Soviet pact. What followed the conquest revealed the true nature of the Nazi regime. The Einsatzgruppen, SS special units, followed closely behind the army with a specific mission: eliminate anyone who could represent future resistance. Intellectuals, priests, officers, Jews. In the first weeks, tens of thousands of people were executed in forests and fields. Most Jews were forced into ghettos in major cities, where they were subjected to a regime of deliberate starvation. For many, it was the prelude to something even worse. More than 50,000 Polish soldiers escaped and eventually reached France, where General Władysław Sikorski organized a government in exile. The Poles would continue fighting, in the air with the Royal Air Force, on land with Allied armies, and at sea with the Royal Navy. Their contribution to final victory would be more significant than popular history has often acknowledged. Great Britain and France had declared war. But while Poland was dying, they did practically nothing to help it. French troops advanced a few kilometers into Germany in the Saar and then stopped without leaving the range of their own artillery. The British Expeditionary Force began deploying in northern France. The initiative remained firmly in Hitler's hands. The Phony War and the waters of the Atlantic. During the winter months of 1939 and 1940, the war on the Western Front was so static that an American journalist called it the Phony War. In Germany, it was referred to as Sitzkrieg, the sitting war. Both armies watched each other along hundreds of kilometers of border without either side making a move. French soldiers on the Maginot Line played cards. The British in Flanders trained in the cold, and Hitler prepared his next move. But in the Atlantic, the war was anything but phony. From the very first day, Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the German submarine fleet, threw everything he had against the British supply routes. Dönitz was a visionary of submarine warfare who had calculated that he needed 300 ocean-going submarines to cut Britain's maritime lifeline. He had 38, but he used them with brutal precision. On the afternoon of September 3rd, 1939, the very day Britain declared war, U-30 sank the ocean liner Athenia off the coast of Ireland. Commander Fritz Julius Lemp believed it to be an armed auxiliary cruiser. It was 1940 hours. The ship carried 1,103 passengers, many of them Canadians and Americans fleeing Europe. 112 people died, including 28 American citizens. The incident painfully recalled the sinking of the Lusitania in 1915 and once again strained relations between Berlin and Washington. The British Royal Navy was incomparably superior to the German Navy in numbers. 12 battleships to none, 5 aircraft carriers to none, more than 60 cruisers to 12. But this superiority was largely irrelevant against the submarine threat. What mattered were escort destroyers and corvettes, and Britain had very few. Merchant ships, thousands of them, crossed the Atlantic alone or in small groups, vulnerable to the U-boats, which increasingly operated in coordination, using the wolf pack tactic that Dönitz had developed in theory during the 1930s. On September 17, 1939, U-29 sank the British aircraft carrier HMS Courageous off the coast of Western Ireland. 519 sailors died. 3 weeks later, on October 14th, U-47, under the command of Lieutenant Commander Gunther Prien, carried out the most daring feat of the early submarine war. It infiltrated through the defences of Scapa Flow, the main base of the home fleet in the Orkneys, and sank the battleship HMS Royal Oak while it lay at anchor asleep. 833 sailors died. When Prien returned to Kiel, he was received as a hero and personally decorated by Hitler with the Knight's Cross. At the opposite end of the naval technology spectrum, the German Navy deployed magnetic mines. Unlike conventional contact mines, these did not require a ship to touch them. They exploded when they detected the magnetic signature of a steel hull passing nearby. Within a few weeks, Britain was losing ships at an alarming rate without understanding the mechanism. The solution came on the night of November 22, 1939, when a German aircraft was observed dropping a mine at low altitude in the Thames estuary during low tide. The mine was left exposed in the mud. Naval technicians disarmed and analyzed it. The response was degaussing, wrapping the hull of ships with a copper cable through which an electric current was passed to neutralize the magnetic signature. Once applied to the entire merchant fleet, magnetic mines lost much of their effectiveness. The pocket battleship Graf Spee represented the other major early surface threat, designed specifically for commerce raiding, with 280mm guns capable of destroying any ship fast enough to catch it. It had left the port of Wilhelmshaven weeks before the start of the war and operated in the South Atlantic and the Indian Ocean, sinking 9 merchant ships. 3 British cruisers, the HMS Exeter, HMS Ajax, and HMNZS Achilles, intercepted it on December 13, 1939, in the Battle of the River Plate, off the Argentine coast. The cruisers suffered severe damage, but they also damaged the Graf Spee enough to force it to seek refuge in the neutral port of Montevideo. Commander Hans Langsdorff was deceived by British intelligence into believing that a superior force awaited outside the harbour. On December 17th, the Graf Spee slowly left the port and was scuttled by its own crew. Langsdorff committed suicide 3 days later. Norway and the Ardennes trap. While the war in the Atlantic intensified, Hitler prepared his next moves with the calm of someone who knows that time is on his side. In November 1939, the Soviet Union had invaded Finland, and the heroic Finnish resistance under the command of Marshal Carl Gustaf Mannerheim, a veteran of the First World War, had demonstrated to the world the deep weaknesses of the Red Army after Stalin's purges. Finland, vastly outnumbered but using guerrilla tactics in snow and deep forest, inflicted devastating losses on poorly led Soviet columns. But the renewed Soviet offensive of February 1940 finally broke the Mannerheim Line, and Finland was forced to cede territory in March. For Hitler, Scandinavia had a precise strategic value. Swedish iron ore, essential for the German war industry, was transported in winter through the Norwegian port of Narvik when the Baltic froze. If the Allies occupied Norway, that vital supply would be cut off. Hitler ordered preparations for the simultaneous invasion of Norway and Denmark. On April 9, 1940, German troops landed in 5 Norwegian ports: Oslo, Kristiansand, Bergen, Trondheim, and Narvik. At the same time, the 1st German Parachute Division, a newly formed unit, seized the airfields of Stavanger and Oslo. Denmark was occupied in less than 24 hours. Its army barely had time to react. In Norway, resistance lasted longer, but the Luftwaffe had total control of the skies, and key cities fell within days. The Allies responded with a landing at Narvik that succeeded in recapturing the port on May 28th, but when the catastrophe in France made withdrawal imperative, the small Norwegian victory was abandoned 6 weeks later. Hitler became convinced that the Allies would use Norway as a base for future operations and kept 250,000 soldiers there for the duration of the war, troops that could have been crucial on other fronts. While the Norwegian campaign was unfolding, a German officer aboard a liaison aircraft became lost over Belgium on January 10, 1940, and made an emergency landing in Mechelen. The papers he carried, the German attack plans against Belgium and France, based on the old Schlieffen Plan, fell into Allied hands. The Allies were expecting exactly that attack and had deployed their best forces in the north, prepared to advance into Belgium and hold the line at the Dial and the Meuse. What they did not know was that this accident had forced the Germans to change their entire plan. The greatest operational genius of the French campaign was not Heinz Guderian, who executed it, but the infantry general Erich von Manstein, who conceived it. Manstein was Chief of Staff of Army Group A and had argued from the beginning that the original plan, advancing through Belgium and turning toward Paris, was too predictable and would repeat the mistakes of the Western Front in 1914. His alternative proposal was radical: concentrate nearly all German panzer forces in front of the Ardennes, the hilly and rugged forest in southern Belgium that the Allies considered virtually impassable for tanks, and drive them in a deep thrust to the English Channel. Allied forces advancing into Belgium would be encircled. The boldness of the plan was also its vulnerability. If the panzer units became stuck in the forest, if the Allies mounted a rapid counterattack on the flank, if the bridges over the Meuse were not seized intact, it could become a disaster. German generals were privately terrified, but Hitler, who had genuine tactical instincts even if he was strategically erratic, loved the idea from the moment Manstein presented it to him in a meeting on February 17, 1940. German forces were reorganized without the Allies detecting it. Army Group B under General von Bock received enough strength for a convincing attack into Belgium and the Netherlands that would draw all Allied reserves northward. Army Group A under General von Rundstedt, with 7 panzer divisions including Guderian's 19th Panzer Corps, waited in front of the Ardennes. The bait was set, the trap was ready. The fall of France, 44 days. May 10, 1940, was a day that changed the world in more than one sense. In London, Neville Chamberlain resigned as Prime Minister after losing parliamentary support following the Norwegian campaign. His successor was Winston Churchill, a man who had spent years warning about Hitler and whose warnings had been systematically ignored. Churchill arrived at 10 Downing Street that same afternoon. That same dawn, Hitler launched his Blitzkrieg against France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. In the north, a full German airborne division dropped paratroopers over Holland to seize bridges and airfields. Assault engineers in gliders attacked the Belgian fortress of Eben-Emael, considered impregnable, and silenced it within hours. The Luftwaffe struck Dutch and Belgian air bases, and as Allied planners had anticipated, Army Group B under von Bock pushed into Belgium. The French and British armies executed exactly the planned maneuver. They advanced into Belgium to occupy the Dial River line. The best Allied units, including most available mechanized infantry and armored forces, moved north. Manstein's trap was working. At that moment, Guderian's panzer columns were emerging from the Ardennes. Units of the 19th Panzer Corps reached the Meuse at the gates of Sedan, well north of the Maginot Line, on the afternoon of May 12th. What Allied planners had declared impossible had happened. 7 armored divisions had crossed 120 kilometers of forested, rugged terrain in less than 3 days, with supply columns and engineering units following closely behind. On May 13th, assault troops crossed the Meuse under heavy fire. Engineers built bridges while Stukas bombed French defensive positions. On May 14th, the panzers began crossing. That same day, the bridgehead was 20 kilometers deep. Allied bombers attempted desperate missions to destroy the bridges. They lost more than 40% of their aircraft and failed to neutralize them. Guderian did not wait for infantry. He did not attack the Maginot Line. He simply drove west as fast as his tanks could move. On May 17th, his spearheads were beyond Peronne. On May 20th, in a 90-kilometer advance in a single day, they took Abbeville at midday, and a battalion of the 2nd Panzer Division reached the Channel coast by midnight. The Allied front had been cut in two. To the north, encircled, were the best divisions of the French army and almost the entire British expeditionary force, more than 300,000 men. To the south, the rest of France. General Maurice Gamelin, Allied Supreme Commander, was unable to process the speed of the collapse. He issued no clear orders during crucial hours. French Prime Minister Paul Reynaud telephoned Churchill on May 15th. "We have lost the battle." Churchill flew to Paris and found Foreign Ministry officials burning documents in the garden. Defeat was already being accepted as inevitable. There was a moment when the Blitzkrieg was genuinely threatened. On May 21st, Colonel Charles de Gaulle, commanding one of the few fully operational French armoured divisions, launched 2 attacks against the southern flank of the German corridor near Arras. Using powerful British Matilda tanks, he inflicted significant losses on the panzer columns. The counterattack lacked the coordination to be decisive. Allied divisions arrived piecemeal rather than in a coordinated thrust, but it proved the German corridor was vulnerable. The German High Command became so alarmed that Field Marshal von Rundstedt recommended a pause to consolidate positions. It was then that the most debated episode of the entire Western campaign occurred. On May 24, 1940, Hitler ordered the panzer forces to halt their advance toward Dunkirk. The standstill order lasted 48 hours. Historical explanations are multiple and not mutually exclusive. Genuine concern over tank attrition in the flooded terrain and canals of Belgian Flanders. Goering's promise that the Luftwaffe alone could destroy the trapped Allied army. The belief that the panzers needed to be preserved for the next phase of the campaign against southern France. Whatever the combination of factors, those 48 hours were decisive. General Alan Brooke, commander of the British Second Corps, wrote in his diary on May 23rd, "Nothing but a miracle can save the British Expeditionary Force." Vice Admiral Bertram Ramsay was ordered to launch Operation Dynamo, the sea evacuation, at 1857 on May 26th. The most optimistic estimates spoke of saving 45,000 men. What followed was one of the most extraordinary stories of the war. Ramsay issued a call to every vessel over 9 meters in length in southern English ports. Hundreds of fishing boats, pleasure craft, ferries and barges crossed the channel, many piloted by their civilian owners under continuous aerial bombardment, picking up soldiers from the beaches and ferrying them to larger destroyers and transports. The RAF threw every available fighter over Dunkirk to protect the evacuation, losing hundreds of aircraft. 7 French and 6 British destroyers were sunk. A quarter of the 665 small vessels did not return. When the evacuation ended on June 4th, more than 338,000 men had been rescued, 41% of them French. The British Army had survived, though with almost no tanks, artillery or heavy equipment. The French rearguard that covered the evacuation, fighting until the last ship left the beaches, was compared by a British officer to the last stand of the Spartans at Thermopylae. On June 5th, 4 hours after the evacuation ended, Germany launched the final phase against southern France. On June 14th, German troops marched into Paris. The swastika was raised on the Eiffel Tower. On June 21st, Hitler travelled to the forest of Compiègne, where the 1918 armistice had been signed. He ordered the same railway carriage brought out. French delegates entered. Hitler presented his terms and left. When the French attempted to request time to consult their government, they were told that if they did not sign immediately, the panzers would resume their advance. They signed. The Summer of Decision, the Battle of Britain. On June 22, 1940, Britain stood alone. Not formally. The vast British Empire, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, India, had declared war on Germany, but its resources were thousands of miles away and would take months to arrive in significant quantities. The British Army had lost almost all its armoured vehicles, heavy artillery and modern equipment at Dunkirk. It had only 25 divisions, armed mainly with rifles, to defend an island facing the coasts of a Europe entirely controlled by Hitler. On July 19th, Hitler delivered a speech in the Reichstag before a delirious crowd of more than 1 million people in the streets of Berlin. He offered Britain peace terms. It could keep its empire. In return, Hitler would have a free hand in Europe. For many in the British government and military establishment, the proposal had a certain logic of survival. Lord Halifax, the Foreign Secretary, seriously considered exploring the terms. Churchill categorically refused. "We shall fight them in every street," he told the War Cabinet privately on May 28th, "and in the end we shall destroy them all." Britain's response was silence. Hitler ordered the Luftwaffe to establish air superiority over the English Channel as a necessary condition for Operation Sea Lion, the amphibious invasion of southern England. Air Marshal Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, had 2,600 fighters and bombers for the task. Air Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding, head of RAF Fighter Command, had fewer than 700 fighters. The numbers seemed decisive. But Dowding had two factors Göring fatally underestimated. The first was radar. Since the mid-1930s, physicist Robert Watson Watt had developed for the RAF a long-range aircraft detection system based on radio pulses. By 1940, a chain of 21 radar stations, 90-meter towers along England's southern and eastern coasts, could detect incoming aircraft at 200 kilometers distance, providing altitude, direction, speed, and estimated numbers. This information was transmitted within seconds to Fighter Command headquarters at Bentley Priory, where controllers dispatched the minimum number of squadrons needed to intercept each raid. Dowding did not need to keep his fighters constantly airborne. He could wait until he knew exactly where to send them. The second factor was geography. German fighters operating over England had such limited range that they could only accompany bombers for minutes over a target before having to turn back. Downed German pilots over England were captured. Downed British pilots over England could return to fly again the next day. Göring chose August 13th as Adlertag, Eagle Day, the start of the main assault. The earlier attacks had damaged several coastal radar stations, but Göring decided not to continue targeting them. He believed radar was a primitive detection system of little tactical value. It was the first of his fatal errors. During the 2 weeks that followed Adlertag, the battle reached brutal intensity. Some RAF pilots flew 7 combat missions in a single day. Dowding rotated squadrons to provide rest, but he never had enough. Many pilots were sent into combat with barely 10 hours on the aircraft they were flying. The Luftwaffe also suffered. Its pilots, accustomed to quick victories in Poland and France, found that British fighters always seemed to be waiting for them. The lack of understanding of the British radar system proved devastating for German planning. By mid-August, the RAF was near its limit. Airfields in southeastern England had been repeatedly damaged. The command and communication system was strained. Pilot losses were unsustainable. If Göring had continued focusing on airfields and radar infrastructure for another 2 weeks, most military historians agree Fighter Command would have collapsed. Then, on the night of August 24th, a formation of Heinkel He-111 bombers lost their way and dropped their bombs on central London. It was the first attack on a non-military target. The next day, Churchill ordered a retaliatory strike on Berlin. 81 RAF bombers flew over the German capital on the night of August 25th to 26th. The damage was minimal, but Hitler was enraged. On September 7th, Göring changed his objective. From then on, bombers would attack London, not RAF airfields. It was the second fatal mistake. The British airfields, desperately needing time to recover, were spared further destruction. On September 15th, the day celebrated in Britain as Battle of Britain Day, the Luftwaffe launched its largest attack on London. Churchill was present in Fighter Command's operations centre. When controllers called for reinforcements from neighbouring groups, he asked, "What reserves do we have?" The answer came, "None." But the Luftwaffe had failed to achieve air superiority. On September 17th, Hitler postponed Operation Sea Lion indefinitely. The Battle of Britain did not end, it faded. Until November 1940, German bombers attacked British cities every night, the Blitz, killing more than 50,000 civilians. Coventry was virtually destroyed on November 10th. The last major raid on London occurred on the night of May 10th to 11th, 1941. But Britain did not surrender. Churchill summed up the battle's legacy with mathematical precision. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. The United States and the arsenal of democracy. Britain had survived the Blitz, but surviving was not winning. To return one day to the offensive, Churchill needed the only country with the industrial and human resources capable of shifting the fundamental balance of the war, the United States. The problem was American public opinion. In July 1940, a poll showed that only 8% of American citizens were willing to enter the war. The memory of the First World War, 120,000 soldiers dead, a continent that collapsed back into rivalries despite Wilson's 14 points, had produced a deep isolationist current. Congress had passed a series of neutrality acts prohibiting the sale of weapons to countries at war. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt understood that isolationism was strategically suicidal in the long term, but he was a pragmatist who knew how far he could push public opinion. He began moving carefully. In September 1940, he announced an agreement under which the United States would transfer 50 World War I destroyers to Britain in exchange for 99-year leases on naval bases in Newfoundland and the Caribbean. It was technically a breach of neutrality, but politically he presented it as a commercial transaction. In November 1940, Roosevelt won the presidential election with 27 million votes against 22 million for the isolationist Republican Wendell Willkie. The mandate was clear. In January 1941, he introduced the Lend-Lease Act to Congress. The United States would supply weapons and war material to Britain and China, and potentially to any country whose defense was vital to American security, and payment could be deferred. Roosevelt explained it with a domestic metaphor. If your neighbor's house is on fire and he asks to borrow your hose, you don't ask for money. You lend it to him and he gives it back after the fire is out. The law was passed in March 1941. For Britain, it was a lifeline. Aircraft, tanks, trucks, food and raw materials began crossing the Atlantic in increasing quantities. Roosevelt extended the American naval patrol zone to Greenland and in July sent US Marines to relieve the British garrison in Iceland, denying German submarines Icelandic ports as bases. The American Navy began escorting convoys in the Western Atlantic. Clashes with U-boats became inevitable. On September 4, 1941, the USS Greer was attacked by a German submarine, which had mistaken it due to the presence of a British aircraft. On October 17th, the USS Kearney was torpedoed while escorting a convoy near Iceland. 11 sailors were killed and the destroyer barely made it back to Reykjavik. The following month, the USS Reuben James was sunk with 115 sailors aboard. Hitler, who at that stage wanted to keep the United States out of the war, ordered his submariners to avoid attacking American ships whenever possible. But at sea at night, during convoy hunts, identification was difficult. The war in the Atlantic was the longest of the entire conflict. It lasted from September 1939 to May 1945 and was, in a sense, the most decisive. If Dönitz had had his 300 submarines in 1939 instead of 38, he might have cut off Britain's supplies before American support arrived. As Churchill wrote in his memoirs, the only thing that truly kept me awake during the war was the U-boat threat. Bletchley Park, the secret that won the war. While the Battle of the Atlantic was unfolding, another war was being fought in a Victorian estate on the outskirts of Milton Keynes, invisible and equally decisive. Bletchley Park was the headquarters of Britain's government code and cipher school, and the secret it held was the Allies' greatest strategic asset. Since the mid-1930s, all German armed forces had adopted the Enigma cipher machine, originally developed as a commercial device in the 1920s to encode their communications. The device used 3 interchangeable rotors whose settings could be configured in millions of different ways, meaning that every typed letter could represent any of 150 million possible combinations. German experts were convinced it was unbreakable. The first breakthroughs came from the Poles. A team of mathematicians from the Biuro Cyfru, the Polish cipher bureau, Marian Rejewski, Jerzy Rojicki, and Henryk Zygalski began working on Enigma in the early 1930s. With the help of documents obtained by French intelligence from a spy inside the German army's cipher department, Hans Thilo Schmidt, who sold information for money, the Poles managed to reconstruct the internal wiring of the rotors and built their own replicas of the machine. By 1938, they were able to decrypt messages regularly. In July 1939, with war clearly imminent, the Poles summoned representatives of French and British intelligence to Warsaw. The British were stunned by what the Poles had achieved. As part of the meeting, the Poles handed over 2 of their Enigma replicas to their allies. 2 weeks later, Poland was invaded. The Polish cryptographers destroyed all evidence of their work and escaped. Some eventually reached Bletchley. Commander Alistair Denniston, head of Bletchley, recruited an extraordinarily unconventional group of mathematicians, chess champions, and crossword solvers. Among them was Alan Turing, a Cambridge mathematician who in 1936 had theoretically described the concept of a universal computing machine. Turing used his ideas to design the bombs, electromechanical decryption machines based on but improved from the Polish bombs that could find Enigma's daily settings by testing permutations at a speed no human effort could match. The network of Y-service listening stations intercepted German radio messages, which were transmitted to Bletchley, where the bombs ran until the correct key was found. Once decrypted, the message was translated, analyzed, and distributed to commanders who needed to know it. Churchill called Bletchley's output his ultra-secret intelligence, and which became the code name Ultra, and he was so protective of it that he insisted no action could be based on ultra-intelligence without first creating a plausible cover story explaining its source. The Germans could not be allowed to know Enigma had been broken. The first dramatic proof of Ultra's value came on June 8, 1940, when Bletchley decrypted signals showing that the German battlecruisers Scharnhorst and Gneisenau were approaching the position of the aircraft carrier HMS Glorious, which was covering the Allied evacuation from Norway. The warning was passed to the Admiralty, which did not relay it to the Glorious's crew, still doubtful of the reliability of the new intelligence source. The carrier was intercepted and sunk with 1,519 men lost. The Royal Navy learned the lesson in the harshest possible way. During the Battle of Britain, Ultra provided Dowding with a clear picture of Luftwaffe order of battle and of Goering's strategy, confirming that his method of committing fighters in minimal necessary numbers rather than mass deployment was correct. When Goering shifted from attacking airfields to bombing London, Dowding knew in advance. In the Atlantic, the capture of German naval Enigma equipment, including rotors seized during the Lofoten raid in March 1941, allowed Bletchley to decrypt U-boat communications with increasing regularity. Convoys could be rerouted away from submarine positions with sufficient warning to avoid them. It is estimated that Ultra shortened the war by at least 2 years. Commandos and the Resistance. Fire under the ashes. Britain could not in 1940 launch a ground offensive against occupied Europe, but Churchill was determined to keep resistance alive in the conquered countries and to harass the occupiers wherever possible. Even while the last soldiers were being evacuated from Dunkirk, he had already instructed his chiefs of staff to create amphibious assault forces. The idea of the commandos, the name taken from the agile Boer units that had fought the British Army in South Africa between 1899 and 1902, was rapidly put into practice. 10 units of 500 men each were formed, trained for seaborne raid operations. Admiral Sir Roger Keyes was appointed Director of Combined Operations. The first raids on the coast of occupied France were of limited value, but they provided experience and demonstrated that it was possible to operate with relative impunity along German-controlled shores. On March 4, 1941, 2 commando units landed unopposed in the Lofoten Islands off the northern coast of Norway. They destroyed factories that converted fish oil into glycerin for explosives, burned fuel depots, and sank several ships in the harbour. They took 225 German prisoners and 115 Norwegian volunteers who joined the Free Norwegian Forces in Britain. But the most valuable result of the raid was one that could not be made public: the capture of spare rotors from a German naval Enigma machine aboard a seized auxiliary vessel in the harbour, which proved of incalculable value to the cryptographers at Bletchley Park. In December 1941, a more ambitious raid on the Norwegian port of Vagsøy involved heavy fighting against the German garrison. The commandos destroyed several industrial installations and sank 8 ships. The operations convinced Hitler that the British would eventually attempt to reoccupy Norway, which is why he kept 250,000 soldiers stationed there throughout the war, troops that could have been vital on the Eastern Front. In July 1940, Churchill created the Special Operations Executive (SOE) with the instruction to set Europe ablaze. Its purpose was to organize, arm, and coordinate resistance movements in occupied countries. Most of its activity focused on France. Agents trained in Britain were infiltrated into France by air RAF pilots flying Lysander short takeoff and landing aircraft into clandestine fields identified by reception committees, or by sea. On the ground, they built resistance networks, organized sabotage against key infrastructure, and prepared local forces to support the eventual Allied invasion. The work was extraordinarily dangerous. The Gestapo and the SD, the SS intelligence service, used radio direction-finding teams to locate clandestine transmitters. Double agents infiltrated networks. The German counterintelligence system became increasingly sophisticated. Many SOE agents were captured, tortured, and executed. Their average life expectancy once in the field was only a few months, but they kept the flame of resistance alive in thousands of communities across occupied Europe. And when the Allies finally landed, the networks they had built proved invaluable. The BBC was another weapon. It broadcast news in all the languages of occupied countries. The Nazis punished listening with death, yet millions of Europeans tuned in secretly. Personal messages broadcast after the 9 o'clock news were codes for resistance groups, seemingly absurd phrases. Uncle Hector polishes his shoes. The oranges of Seville are sweet, carried precise meanings for those trained to understand them. Barbarossa, Hitler's greatest mistake. Adolf Hitler had written in Mein Kampf that the conquest of living space in the East was Germany's destiny. The Soviet Union was not only an ideological enemy, it was the geopolitical prize that would make the German people the dominant race on the planet. The vast plains of Ukraine, the oil fields of the Caucasus, the resources of Siberia, Hitler saw all of it as Germany's equivalent of the American Wild West. Throughout the winter and spring of 1941, from his retreat at the Berghof in the Bavarian Alps, Hitler planned Operation Barbarossa. His generals privately warned him about the scale of the challenge. The Soviet Union had nearly 200 million inhabitants, a territory of more than 22 million square kilometers, and an army that, although weakened by Stalin's 1937 to 1938 purges, in which 3/4 of Red Army generals had been executed or imprisoned, was still the largest in the world by sheer numbers. None of them dared vote against the operation. To secure the southern flank, Hitler had launched a lightning campaign in the Balkans in April 1941, when Yugoslavia, whose pro-German government had been overthrown by a pro-British coup, refused to allow German troop passage toward Greece. Yugoslavia fell in 11 days. Greece, despite British aid, in less than 3 weeks. Athens was occupied on April 27, 1941. On June 22, 1941, at 3:15 in the morning, more than 4 million German, Romanian, Finnish and Italian soldiers crossed the Soviet border along a 2,900-kilometer front. It was the largest military operation in human history. The Luftwaffe struck at dawn. In the first hours, it destroyed more than 1,200 Soviet aircraft, most of them on the ground. Panzer columns crossed the Bug River at multiple points and began penetrating Soviet territory at a speed that even surpassed the campaign in France. The Soviet army, paralyzed by decades of terror and by Stalin's obsessive refusal to accept warning signs, despite receiving dozens of intelligence reports about the imminent attack, all of which he dismissed as British provocations designed to drag him into war, responded with total disorganization. Unit commanders who requested permission to withdraw or reposition received none. Those who acted independently risked execution. The collapse was catastrophic. On June 29th, just 7 days after the offensive began, 2 panzer groups closed in a pincer near Minsk, trapping more than 300,000 Soviet soldiers. German infantry units arriving days later to clear the pockets found endless columns of prisoners marching westward. Stalin, upon receiving the news, appeared to suffer a psychological breakdown. He remained silent for nearly a week, withdrawn to his dacha in Kuntsevo. It was not until July 3rd that he finally appealed by radio for patriotic resistance to save the motherland. In Britain, Churchill received news of Barbarossa with a relief he did not try to hide. In his radio speech that evening, he was completely direct. "Any man or state who fights against Nazism will have our aid. We shall go forward together." The ideological nature of communism mattered less than the fact that Britain now had a massive ally. The next day, he sent a mission to Moscow to sign a mutual assistance treaty with Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov. The Blitzkrieg continued at a speed that was difficult to follow. Smolensk, 400 kilometers from Moscow, fell in July. On July 22nd, another double encirclement east of Smolensk trapped 310,000 more Soviet soldiers. It seemed nothing could stop Germany before winter arrived. Then Hitler made the first of his major strategic errors on the Eastern Front. Instead of allowing Guderian to continue the direct drive toward Moscow, which in August 1941 was only 200 kilometers away and appeared open, Hitler ordered the panzer forces diverted south to assist in taking Kiev. Guderian protested with near insubordination. Hitler was inflexible. The decision was tactically brilliant. On September 16th, Guderian's panzer forces and those of Army Group South closed east of Kiev in the largest encirclement of troops in history. More than 500,000 Soviet soldiers were captured or killed. It was the greatest tactical victory of the war. It was also the one that saved Moscow. The time required for the Kiev operation was exactly the time the campaign depended on. When Guderian turned north again and the assault on Moscow resumed on September 20th, renamed Operation Typhoon, the autumn rains had begun. Russian roads, largely unpaved dirt tracks, turned into rivers of mud that literally swallowed German vehicles up to their axles. Tanks and trucks became stuck. Supply columns could not advance. Blitzkrieg depended on speed, and the mud brought it to a halt. By late October, Army Group Center was still 90 kilometers from Moscow. In Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, Army Group North had completed the encirclement of the city in September, and Hitler had decided not to storm it, but to starve it into submission. The result was the longest and deadliest siege of the modern war. By November, more than 11,000 people were dying per month from hunger and cold, with temperatures dropping to minus 30 degrees Celsius. Only the opening of a supply route across the frozen Lake Ladoga in December prevented total extinction. On December 5, 1941, German forward units were 19 kilometers from Red Square. Some reconnaissance reports claimed they could see the golden domes of the Kremlin. That night, the temperature suddenly dropped to minus 35. Tank engines would not start. Weapons jammed. German soldiers wearing summer uniforms because the General Staff had assumed the campaign would be finished before autumn suffered mass frostbite. On December 5th, the Germans halted their attack, and at dawn the same day the Red Army counterattacked. Stalin had received in November a message from his top spy in Japan, Richard Sorge, the most effective intelligence agent of the Second World War, confirming that Japan would not attack Siberia. Immediately, more than 30 fully equipped divisions trained for winter warfare began moving by rail from Siberia to the Western fronts. On December 5th, more than 500,000 fresh troops were in position around Moscow. The Soviet counteroffensive was devastating. Columns of T-34 tanks emerged from the snow in the darkness. German soldiers, who believed they had already defeated their enemy, were struck by a force that in theory should have been exhausted. On December 19th, Hitler dismissed his commander-in-chief, Field Marshal Walter von Brauchitsch, and assumed direct command of the army himself. Guderian was removed. 35 more generals were dismissed. Hitler issued the order that there would be no more withdrawals, soldiers would fight and, if necessary, die where they stood. The order helped stabilize the front but marked the beginning of the end of Germany's dynamic warfare strategy. Blitzkrieg required tactical flexibility. The doctrine of no retreat eliminated it. Germany had failed to conquer the Soviet Union before winter, and the Soviet Union was not going to surrender. Stalingrad, the point at which the world changed. On December 7, 1941, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor irreversibly changed the nature of the war. Hitler, in an act of strategic recklessness that even his own generals could not understand, declared war on the United States 4 days later on December 11th, without any consultation with his general staff and without being bound by any treaty to do so. Within 24 hours, he had made the greatest industrial power in the world his enemy. The decision reflected the internal logic of Hitler's thinking. He believed the United States would enter the war sooner or later anyway, preferred to do so on his own terms, and trusted that Japan would keep the Americans occupied in the Pacific long enough for Germany to finish the job in Europe and Russia. It was a miscalculation on every premise. With the United States in the war, the flow of material to Great Britain and the Soviet Union became a tide. The Lend-Lease program supplied the USSR between 1941 and 1945 with more than 400,000 vehicles, trucks, jeeps, cars, 14,000 aircraft, 13,000 tanks, and massive quantities of food, communications equipment, and industrial gear. Soviet historians minimized this contribution for decades for ideological reasons, but Marshal Georgy Zhukov privately acknowledged that without American trucks, the Soviet Union would not have been able to carry out most of its major offensive operations. On the Eastern Front, Hitler needed a new strategy for 1942. The original plan of attacking along the entire front had proven militarily impossible. His economic advisors informed him that German oil reserves were critically low. The solution was to concentrate the effort in the south, seize the oil fields of the Caucasus. Army Group A would advance south toward the Caucasus, while Army Group B covered the flank along the Don River. The operation began on June 28, 1942, with spectacular successes. Soviet troops on the Don were encircled, another 200,000 prisoners. The Black Sea port city of Sevastopol in Crimea, which had withstood an 8-month siege under artillery bombardment, including the largest railway gun ever built, the German 800mm Dora, finally fell at the end of June. Then Hitler made another mistake. While Army Group B advanced along the Don, the Führer impulsively ordered it to take Stalingrad as well, a vulgar industrial city of no immediate strategic value, but whose name was symbolically intolerable to Hitler because it bore the name of his personal enemy. Army Group B was thus given two simultaneous objectives: to cover the flank of the advance toward the Caucasus and to capture a major urban city. This divided and diluted the effort precisely when concentration would have been vital. On August 23, 1942, General Friedrich Paulus and his 6th Army crossed the Don and began the final assault on Stalingrad. A panzer thrust reached the Volga north of the city. It seemed the assault would be quick, but the Soviet defenders, under the command of General Vasily Chuikov and with Stalin's explicit orders that the city would not be evacuated, turned Stalingrad into the hell that would make Blitzkrieg impossible. Chuikov's tactic was to embrace the enemy, to keep the front lines so close that Stukas could not bomb without killing their own troops. Fighting took place house by house, room by room. The Soviets used sewers for movement and ruins for snipers. Sergeant Vasily Zaitsev, whose story would be popularized decades later, achieved more than 200 confirmed kills from enemy positions. Each city block became an independent fortress that changed hands several times a day. Soviet reinforcements crossed the Volga at night under artillery and air fire. Thousands reached the opposite bank. Thousands others remained in the river. By mid-October, the Germans had pushed the defenders into a perimeter of only a few kilometers along the Volga. Total capture seemed a matter of days. On October 4th, Paulus launched what was announced as the final assault. A German officer wrote, "The advance is measured in corpses, not meters." Meanwhile, Marshal Zhukov was secretly preparing the operation that would change the course of the war. More than 1 million fresh troops, 13,000 guns, 900 tanks, and over 1,000 aircraft were moved covertly into the combat zone. On November 19, 1942, after an 80-minute artillery preparation that literally shook the ground for kilometers, Soviet T-34 tanks burst through the northern flank of German positions. The following day, an equivalent attack struck the southern flank. On November 23rd, the two pincers closed west of Stalingrad. Paulus's 6th Army, 330,000 men, was encircled. Paulus could have attempted a breakout immediately. He had fuel for about 80 kilometers. The Soviets had not yet fully consolidated the encirclement, but Hitler ordered him to hold position and wait for relief. Goering guaranteed that the Luftwaffe could supply the 700 tons of daily provisions needed for the army to survive. It was a lie. The Luftwaffe never delivered more than 80 tons on any day, and usually far less. The transport aircraft fleet was insufficient, the destination airfields were under constant fire, and Soviet aviation increasingly controlled the airspace. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, the German Army's best operational commander, launched Operation Winter Storm on December 12, 1942, an attempt by panzer forces to break the Soviet encirclement and open a corridor to Paulus. For 2 days, the advance was promising. Then Soviet resistance hardened, and on December 23rd, the attempt stalled 30 kilometers from the city. Manstein recommended that Paulus attempt a breakout to the south. Paulus requested Hitler's authorization. Hitler refused. On January 8, 1943, the Soviets invited the trapped Germans to surrender. The Germans rejected the offer. On January 10th, the Red Army began the systematic liquidation of the pocket. German divisions collapsed one by one. On January 31, 1943, Friedrich Paulus, promoted to Field Marshal by Hitler only days earlier under the belief that no German Field Marshal would ever surrender, emerged from the basements of the Stalingrad department stores with his hands raised. More than 100,000 men marched into captivity in the east. Only 5,000 would ever return to Germany. The Battle of Stalingrad cost Germany and its allies 300,000 casualties. The Red Army suffered a similar number, plus civilians. In total, around 1 million human beings died in or around Stalingrad between August 1942 and February 1943. Kursk, the end of the German initiative. The Soviet victory at Stalingrad opened a winter counteroffensive that, within weeks, recaptured both Kursk and Kharkov. But in March 1943, Manstein launched a brilliant counterattack that retook Kharkov and stabilized the front. The result was that the Eastern Front map was left with a large Soviet salient centered on Kursk, penetrating deeply into German lines. A bulge about 200 kilometers wide and 150 kilometers deep, temptingly exposed. Hitler decided it would become the focus of the Great Summer Offensive of 1943. The operation was called Citadel. The two flanks of the salient would be attacked simultaneously, Army Group Center from the north and Army Group South from the south. If the two pincers closed, 8 Soviet armies would be trapped. It would be the greatest blow since Stalingrad, and this time the Germans would have a secret weapon. The Tiger I, weighing 55 tons, was a formidable tank. Its 88mm gun could destroy any Soviet tank at over 2 kilometers, and its frontal armor was virtually impenetrable to the T-34's guns. The Panther, lighter at 43 tons, also had a high-velocity 75mm gun capable of piercing T-34 armor. Both were technologically superior to the standard Soviet tank. Hitler insisted on waiting until enough of these machines were available, delaying the start of the operation until July. Those weeks of waiting proved fatal. Marshal Zhukov had already anticipated the plan. Shortly afterward, he received confirmation from a Soviet agent inside the German High Command. The Soviets built around the Kursk salient the most elaborate defensive network of the entire war. 8 successive lines of trenches, minefields of unprecedented density, up to 4,000 mines per kilometer of front in some sectors, layered anti-tank positions, and vast artillery reserves registered on the most likely German armored routes. More than 1.3 million Soviet soldiers, 3,600 tanks, and over 2,000 aircraft were mobilized to defend the salient. On July 5, 1943, when German commanders ordered the attack to begin, Soviet observers had been monitoring preparations for hours. At 2:20 a.m., before the German assault even began, the Red Army launched a massive counter-battery bombardment that struck German staging areas for 40 minutes. Even so, at dawn, the panzer forces advanced. The results were disastrous. In the north, Army Group Center advanced barely 10 kilometers in a week, suffering 25,000 casualties and the loss of more than 200 tanks. In the south, progress was somewhat better, a wedge 40 kilometers deep, but at the cost of 10,000 dead and 350 tanks destroyed. On July 12th, Zhukov committed his armored reserves. 900 tanks charged into the German flank near Prokhorovka in what became the largest tank battle in history, nearly 2,000 vehicles in an area of just 10 square kilometers. The T-34s broke into German formations and opened fire at point-blank range, negating the Panther's superior range advantage. At the end of a single day of brutal combat, the Germans had lost another 350 tanks and were retreating. By July 23rd, all territory gained had been recaptured by the Soviets. Operation Citadel had cost Germany at least 50,000 casualties and more than 700 tanks. The German army would never again launch a major strategic offensive on the Eastern Front. The initiative had permanently passed to the Red Army. How close it came. The answer to the question that opens this account is not simple. Germany came extremely close to conquering Europe at least 4 specific moments, each of which, had it unfolded differently, might have changed the final outcome. The first was Dunkirk. If Hitler had not ordered the panzer forces to halt in May 1940, if Guderian and Rundstedt had continued their advance and destroyed the British Expeditionary Force on the beaches, Britain would have lost its only land army. Without an army, without the ability to continue resistance, Churchill would likely have fallen politically, and his successor might have accepted the peace terms Hitler offered in July 1940. Without Britain in the war, there would have been no base for the United States to enter the European conflict, no basis for the 1944 invasion, and no Western Front. Germany could have concentrated all its resources in the East. The second moment was the Battle of Britain. If Goering had not made the mistake of shifting targets from RAF airfields to cities on September 7, 1940, if he had continued attacking fighter command infrastructure for 2 more weeks, the British Air Force would have collapsed. Without air superiority, Operation Sea Lion would have become a real possibility. An occupied or defeated Britain would have radically altered the global balance of the war. The third critical moment was the summer of 1941. If Hitler had not ordered Guderian to turn south in August 1941 to capture Kiev, if he had allowed the direct push toward Moscow while weather conditions still permitted it, it is possible that the Soviet capital would have fallen before winter. The psychological and political effect of Moscow's fall is difficult to assess. Stalin had contingency plans in the Urals, and the Soviet Union had survived capital relocations under extreme conditions before. But the loss of the country's main railway and logistical hub and its symbolic center of resistance would have created a massive crisis, perhaps unresolved. Perhaps it would simply have prolonged the war by another year. The fourth and final moment was the Soviet winter of December 1941. If the Germans had reached Moscow before mud and ice halted them, if Zhukov's Siberian divisions had arrived too late to counterattack, the outcome might have been different, but none of those things happened. Great empires are built on long chains of correct decisions and overcome adversity. Hitler's was built on a limited number of brilliant victories, followed by increasingly severe strategic errors: the delay in attacking Moscow, the declaration of war on the United States, the obsession with Stalingrad, and the tactical inflexibility that turned Blitzkrieg into a rigid machine incapable of adapting to the largest adversary it had ever faced. In the summer of 1945, when Soviet soldiers raised the red flag over the ruined Reichstag and American and British armies advanced from the west, the gap between what Hitler had conquered and what he had been able to hold was a graveyard of 70 million dead. The story of how close he came to winning is also inevitably the story of why he lost.